There's a question I get asked all the time from experienced painters, and it usually sounds something like this. I know how to draw, I know anatomy, I can get a likeness, and I love loose brushwork like Sargent's. So why do my paintings still just feel like a glorified photograph? Do I just not have a style? And usually, the follow-up question they ask me is, what brushes or exercises actually made your paintings look loose? If I had to distill my answer into a single sentence, it would be this. I didn't loosen up because of the right tool or the single right exercise. I loosened up once I changed when and where the decisions were being made for my painting. But that probably raises a bigger question. If looseness isn't about talent or personality or painting faster or using bigger brushes or just having the right exercise, what is it actually about? How does looseness happen as a style? Most painters are told some version of, if they want to paint more loosely, use fewer brushstrokes, stop overworking, just paint faster. Or, my personal favorite, just trust yourself. And on the surface, that advice is well-intentioned and, it can make sense. But here's the real question. Why doesn't that work? Because all of that advice assumes the problem is happening inside the painting. Or worse, it assumes that the problem is happening inside of you. It assumes that you're getting tight because you're hesitant or you're timid or you're overthinking. And yeah, that can totally happen sometimes, but that's not the big problem that I see. What I see is painters trying to solve too many problems at the same time. They're asking their reference for their painting to answer all of these questions at once and more. Questions like, is the likeness correct? Is the anatomy correct? Are the values accurate? Are the edges soft enough? Are they hard enough? Is this color right? Is it more of a green or is it more of an orange? Does this feel painterly yet? What brush should I be using? And the list goes on. That's not a talent or an innate style problem. That is simply a recipe for decision overload. So here's the next question we have to ask. If tightness isn't about fear or confidence or just something innate to your personality, well, where is it actually coming from? Tightness happens when style decisions are being made too late in your painting. So when you sit down with a reference and you haven't already decided how much information you want to include, what kinds of marks belong in the painting and what kinds of marks don't, what kinds of colors you're going to harmonize the painting around and what colors you're going to omit, and what information gets stated clearly versus what information can merely get suggested. Well, your brain defaults to the safest and simplest option. And that simplest option is just copy what you see in the reference. Describe everything, filter nothing. And that's when paintings start to turn into careful, painstaking copies. So the real issue here isn't, how do I loosen this up? The real issue is, what am I aiming for in the first place with this painting? And that leads to the big shift. So here's the shift stated clearly. I stopped asking the reference how to paint, and I started showing up with a roadmap for the kind of marks I wanted to make. And don't worry, if you aren't 100% sure what precise style you're aiming for with your work, or you have a vague idea, like you want to loosen up, but you can't picture it perfectly, I've got you. I've put together a workbook that I actually share with my students that guides you through this process, starting from absolute zero, all the way to getting crystal clear on what your unique style looks like. The link is in the description to get your copy, or you can go ahead and scan this code. Now, once you start pursuing that style, your personal roadmap to looseness, that could raise a genuine concern, which is, okay, but doesn't that just risk losing the likeness? That's the fear everyone has, that if they get too stylish, it just won't look realistic enough. Or when we're talking about portraits, it just won't look like the specific person you're trying to depict. So let's talk about that. For years, I would start a portrait by just going straight to the photo. I'd think, all right, if I just stay accurate enough, I can loosen it up later. But later never actually came, because once accuracy becomes the foundation, once precision is your guiding force, looseness kind of feels like sabotage. Like you're a kid about to get scolded for coloring outside the lines. So instead, I flipped the order. Before touching the reference, I warmed up by really reviewing and refamiliarizing myself with the kind of art that I actually wanted to make. Not just like scrolling Instagram or vague inspiration or just reminding myself of key phrases like looseness or beautiful brushwork. No, I would actually get targeted visual calibration. So I looked at paintings where I already admired the degree of simplification, the brush economy, how much was said and how much was left alone. And I did this in a very specific way. So the workbook goes into exactly how I distinguished art that I liked from art that was guiding me. So I think that's going to be a really great resource and speak to that specific concern if you have it. But let's just say, for the sake of keeping this video concise and actionable, let's just say you jump to the next concern that this raises. And this is a really common one, which is, okay, but isn't that just copying other artists? So this is where people really misunderstand the tradition of learning from master paintings. For hundreds of years, the main way that great painters got so incredibly good is that they dedicated huge chunks of their training to copying masterpieces from the artists who came before them. Little known fact, and man, I bet someone in the comments is going to claim that I'm wrong, but this is actually what art museums were for. They were for training the next generation of artists, putting great artworks all in one place so that young, aspiring art students could come in and learn from the masters without having to go hunt for those paintings that they would study from. So when it came to copying for those artists who, were working long ago that we all admire, this exercise wasn't about borrowing someone else's style. It was about making sure that they weren't reinventing the wheel. It allowed them to stand on the shoulders of the artists who actually came before them and honor the work that they put in by trusting that by really following in those footsteps, it would put them on the right path. And what is the key thing that this practice teaches? It's decision-making without overwhelm. So when Sargent or Zorn or Sorolla would do a short, non-precious master study, they weren't inventing, how loose is too loose, how much structure is enough, where do I stop? Because those decisions had already been solved by the artists they are studying. Same thing applies when you do this exercise. So instead of negotiating key decisions in a high-stakes original painting, you're actually rehearsing them through the master study. And that rehearsal matters because once you've physically experienced what it feels like to make the marks you want to make, once they're in your hand and your muscle memory, something meaningfully changes. That's what I found on this painting that you're seeing unfold here. I went through this exact step that I'm describing. Not only did I warm myself up by spending time with the paintings that constitute the guiding light for my style, but I actually warmed up with a master study. I looked at a specific painting that I thought really best embodied what I was shooting, and I simply took the time to go through and try to replicate that painting myself so I could feel what it was like to make those kinds of decisions and those kinds of brush marks. And then I turned around and jumped into this painting, and it set me up to be so much looser than my default. And when you do that often enough, your default actually starts to shift. And that brings us to the next question, which is, what happens when you finally return to your photo reference for an original painting? So when I came back to my reference for this painting, the photo no longer had total authority over the direction I would take this piece. It wasn't telling me, describe this exactly. It was simply giving me a jumping off point for my subject and my composition. Then I would flesh out that jumping off point by borrowing what I had learned from my favorite masterworks and the master copy that I did as a warm-up. So, how far can I push this shape? Or where does the likeness actually live? What can I safely leave out without sacrificing this portrait's ability to look like the sitter? Because the stylistic decisions were already made, I didn't actually need something like a grid to lock in the likeness. I didn't need, endless micro adjustments or constant futile comparison to the photo, which leads to something important. Why didn't the likeness just fall apart in this piece? And this is the part that surprises people. So likeness doesn't come from describing everything in granular detail. It comes from hierarchy. So when you decide in advance what matters most, what carries the identity of the sitter, and what information can simply be implied, you stop flattening the painting with equal attention everywhere. Over-description really weakens the stylistic identity of the piece. But when your hand already knows what kind of marks belong, you don't overcorrect. When your mind knows what kind of information you can afford to leave out, it stops fiddling and over-describing. Then the painting stays open because you're not negotiating style mid-process. And that brings us to the question most painters are really asking, which is, okay, but how do I figure out what my roadmap is? This is where so many painters get stuck. They understand the idea, but they're still left asking, well, okay, what kind of marks do I actually want? What kind of compositions should I be using? Do I need rule of thirds? Or, should I be painting still life and landscape in addition to portraits? How loose is too loose for me? What kind of colors do I like? And how do I practice before I paint? And I'm guessing that asking all of that when you're sitting in front of the canvas is exhausting. Actually, I don't need to guess because I've been there and I've helped so many students through this that I know it's exhausting. So that's why I made this workbook on how to get crystal clear on your signature style, because that is going to lay the groundwork for this entire roadmap we've been talking about. The workbook isn't there to tell you what your style should be. It is not a one-size-fits-all, prescription. It is a guide to walk you through defining your unique style step by step, start to finish, so you're not defaulting to photorealism just because it feels safe. This is how you ditch photorealism without throwing real skill away. So now you understand the real shift that has to happen for your portraits. Looseness isn't about confidence, it's about timing. It's about making the big stylistic decisions way before the painting itself starts, so your painting doesn't collapse under all that pressure. But here is the next problem most painters run into. Even with a roadmap, they don't stick with it long enough to actually rewire their habits and their muscle memory. So if you've ever had that experience where you go to a workshop and suddenly you are painting in a style that feels more aligned for you, and then you go back home to your studio only to just tighten right back up, well, that is totally normal. But if you don't solve that, everything we just talked about here tends to fall apart. So if you want this to be the year your work actually changes and not just improves temporarily, make sure to watch this video next.